Hello, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with Plato's forms? Plato's forms. Plato was a famous ancient Greek philosopher who is credited with this idea of forms. Uh, this is a philosophical idea, but it's also a very important idea, especially in terms of Christianity and religion. Now, Plato had this allegory of the cave. He called it the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is meant to explain forms. What exactly does he mean by a form? Now, the allegory of the cave basically is a story, and the story takes place in a cave. And so there's this cave. And in this cave, there are chained prisoners who are human beings who are sitting near the back wall of the cave, and they're positioned in a row, and they're positioned such that they can only see the back of the cave wall. They can't turn around and look behind them. They're chained together. They can only look forward, and they can only see the back wall of the cave. You got your prisoners, and all they can see is the back wall of the cave. Now, at the front of the cave, there's a bonfire, a great big bonfire. And this bonfire, of course, is illuminating the entire cave. So it's streaming light to the back of the cave. Now, in between the bonfire and the prisoners, the chained prisoners who can't look behind their shoulder, but can only look at the back of the cave wall, there is a parapet, essentially a stage. And on this stage is a puppet show. There's a puppet master, and he's got a bunch of puppets on strings, and he's performing a puppet show on this stage, this parapet in the middle of the cave. So what happens is the light from the fire casts a shadow of the puppet show on the cave wall in the back of the cave. So you can see the shadow of the puppet show here. You can see the shadows. Now, these chained prisoners, the chained prisoners can only see the back wall of the cave. So they can only see the shadow of the puppet show. They can't turn around and actually look at the puppet show. They can only see the shadow of the puppet show. So this allegory uh, is to demonstrate to us that uh, being human beings who are chained and sitting on the ground of the back of the cave, only looking in the one direction where you can see a shadow, aren't capable of seeing the actual puppet show. And the puppet show is an allegory for forms. It's the idea of forms. And the shadow that the puppet show casts is an allegory for material reality. That is what we as human beings see, things that are made, created things moving around that uh, exhibit the characteristics of these forms, but are not the forms themselves. They're just shadows of the forms, the real forms, which are the puppets on the parapet, which we can't see, but we can see the shadow that these forms cast, which is our material reality. So this is how Plato explains what he means by a form. Now, uh, forms are things like, for instance, a circle. A perfect circle would be a form. So, for instance, in material reality, there are things that exist that that we call certain forms, like that's a house. Now, there's all different ways to build a house, and houses can all look different. But the idea of a house is a unifying idea, which you could think of as a form. If a house has a certain form, even though there's an infinite different types of houses, particular houses that you could build, they're all houses. So this idea of the house, you could think of that as a form of a house. Same thing with like a circle, perfect circle. All right. Now that's not a perfect circle, but that's the best I can do. So you can think of geometric forms: a circle, square, rectangle, triangle. Uh, these are all forms. These are ideas, uh, and they can exist in our created material reality in different ways. Like the tire of a car exhibits the form of a circle. The car itself could exhibit the form of a rectangle. Geometry and mathematics essentially are full of forms and these ideas that may exhibit themselves in created reality. What Plato was saying about forms is that these forms are higher realities than material reality, than our created world. So Plato's saying that these forms have a reality uh, in truth um, beyond our reality and some sort of higher reality, that these forms exist, that they're actual real things. Um, and this is an important philosophical idea of the higher reality of forms themselves. Uh, so they they're called Platonic forms. Um, the idea that you can think about it, mathematics itself. Does mathematics itself have a reality that's higher and than our created reality? Uh, Does it exist somewhere in a pure form, in a higher reality, higher, I don't know, higher dimension than the one we're in? This pure mathematics, this pure geometry. It's understandable that you might think that, and that's what Plato thought. And there are a lot of people throughout history who've thought the same thing. When you contemplate the idea of forms, uh, and you ask yourself, well, where are they? Right? Where is mathematics? Where is it? I mean, it seems to be a thing in and of itself, but it's not a material thing. So it seems like it's immaterial. Uh, so it's got to be somewhere, right? So where is it? Uh, and that's where you get this idea of it's in a higher reality, some higher, purer reality. And that's what the allegory of the cave is all about. It's about demonstrating the proof of this higher reality that houses these forms. And in the allegory of the cave, the puppet show is this higher reality of which humans can only see the shadow cast from that puppet show. So the allegory of the cave is really meant as a proof of a higher reality containing these Platonic forms and explaining why you can't see them because you're chained together facing only the back of the wall and you can't turn around and look at it. So you can see the appeal for that kind of idea. Um, I personally don't agree with that at all. I don't think that that's real. And I'll explain to you why I don't think that's real. Um, the idea of forms are ideas. They're ideas. Even a circle is an idea. Mathematics is an idea. Uh, Rectangles, squares, circles, triangles, houses, any sort of form that you can dream up is an idea. And all ideas originate in the brain. So, because the brain is made of matter, brain matter, all ideas are created by matter. They're not greater than matter, they're a derivative reality of matter. They're created by matter. So, how could they be a higher reality? They're not. They're not a higher reality. They're a derivative reality of the human brain. Where are ideas located in reality? Only one place, here in a material brain, or perhaps in a material computer. But ideas are a derivative reality. It's not a higher reality. So I don't see how Platonic forms could possibly be true. They're not. And another problem with this idea of Platonic forms is um, all forms uh, exist in material reality. An idea, a derivative of the brain. So if you point to anything that has this particular form, it's going to be something that's made of parts. Like you say, well, a circle. Well, the tire on that car, guess what? That's made of parts. A circle itself is made of parts. You look at a circle and it's got little parts in it. So every form, even as an idea, every form is made of parts. Every form is some sort of physical reality, a material physical reality, and all material physical realities are made of parts because the universe is made of parts. like atoms and quarks and uh, photons. So all forms are ultimately made of parts. They're all made of parts. Even the ideas themselves. I mean, an idea itself, you say, well, it's an idea made of parts. Well, it is, because an idea only exists in the brain, and the brain creates a derivative reality, and that derivative reality is made of parts because the brain has moving parts in it. So every idea is ultimately in the brain, and it is made of parts. So all forms are made of parts. So this Platonic idea of a form, it's an idea that this thing is real and it is a higher reality, but it's not a material reality, and that it's not made of parts. It's an idea. It's not a thing that's made of parts. But that's just not true. All forms ultimately are made of parts. They're all ideas derived from the human brain, which is made of parts. So, uh, you know, the idea that anything could do something that is not itself made of parts um, is highly questionable. It seems that anything in reality that does anything complicated at all is made of parts. So the whole idea of Platonic forms is, in my opinion, very archaic, and it's not based in reality. The reality is that everything is made of parts, and Platonic forms are simply ideas that are a derivative of the human mind, which itself is made of parts. So, and another thing is um, the question of, well, God, right? God is an uncaused being. That means God is not made of parts. We call this principle about God divine simplicity. So, God is not made of parts. God is uncaused. But God is also the storehouse of all unactualized potentials. So God is the storehouse of everythingness. God knows everything that is logically possible that can be created and has the power to create those things. And that would include forms. So forms are created things. The brain is a created thing. So, where's the idea of the form really located? Well, it's really located in the mind of God, which is the storehouse of unactualized potentials. But the mind of God is also uncaused and not made of parts. So ultimately, Platonic forms are created things because God's mind is not made of parts, but Platonic forms are made of parts. So Platonic forms have to be created in order to be real or actualized. They can't exist in God's mind in a higher form, let's say, because God's mind is not made of parts, but Platonic forms are made of parts. So um, they don't have a reality unless God creates them. Because God's mind is uncaused and not made of parts. So this whole idea of Platonic forms being this sort of higher reality doesn't even make sense in terms of God's mind. God's mind is uncaused. Platonic forms are caused and made of parts. God's mind is not made of parts. Therefore, Platonic forms are created things. They're not uncaused things. They don't have a higher reality. So Uh, the idea of a form itself is very iffy. The idea that a form could exist that isn't made of parts really smacks of magic. This idea that there's a subsistent form. Now, I know a lot of theologians rely on this idea of forms and for explaining things like the soul, for instance. But the problem with forms is that they're not made of parts. Subsistent forms are things in and of themselves, like the idea of a soul, for instance, not being made of parts. And this is attached to Plato's idea of forms. This is Plato. Plato is the one who really is responsible for this whole idea of subsistent forms. But the whole idea that something can do something complicated and not be made of parts is uh, basically impossible, except in the one case of an uncaused God. That's the only exception. And God is mysterious. And there's no way to explain God, how God does complicated things, despite not being made of parts. We call this divine simplicity, but it's a mystery. We just chalk it up as a mystery. We don't know. It's an uncaused being. Who knows? Uh, but when you're talking about caused things like forms, every caused thing is made of parts, and complicated things have to be made of parts in order to do something. So this idea of a subsistent form really is nonsense. Um, and this idea of Platonic forms is nonsense. Uh, so uh, when you, when you have this idea in Christianity of a form, something that's existing can do complicated things and yet not be made of parts, uh, you got to really ask yourself, that sounds like magic, doesn't it? I mean, you're essentially getting something from nothing. You're getting complicated behavior without moving parts to explain it. Well, how's that possible in a created thing? Well, it's not. It's not possible in a created thing. So this whole idea is really magical nonsense. It's something from nothing. You're saying something that doesn't have parts can do complicated things, like a soul can, you know, understand things, experience things. Well, those are complicated things. So, and you're saying it can do that without actually being made of parts, but it's a created thing nonetheless. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. That's impossible. Well, so what is that? That's magic. That's something from nothing. You're claiming you can do complicated things without having parts. Well, that's something from nothing. And that's pretty much the definition of pure magic. So ultimately, the idea of Platonic forms as a higher reality is really a magical notion. It's impossible. It's an impossibility. It's magical. Um, I don't find how that makes any real sense. And you really don't want your basis for believing in Christianity and God to be something that's magical, do you? No, of course not. Because then you have to question why you believe it, right? There are better explanations, and I've done videos on this, explaining, about the soul and how it could actually be made of parts, which I called exomatter. And in terms of relative size, it could be tiny compared to anything else. So there is a plausible explanation that doesn't involve magic, but it's simple. But it's clearly not the mainstream explanation, which is this. Anyway, it's an important concept, Platonic forms, and uh, you know, there you go. I personally don't think you're trapped in Plato's cave. Some people think you are. I'm not one of those people. I think the allegory of the cave is amusing in terms of, well, it gives you sort of a demonstration of being careful because maybe you don't know everything that's going on. But in terms of Platonic forms, I think it's nonsense. Essentially, it's nonsense. It's magical nonsense. But it's an interesting allegory nonetheless, and it's taught in philosophy classes, and you should know about it. All right. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Please press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. And take care.